Well, welcome to week two. As we get started, just a few things. First, thank you for a wonderful first class and for being so engaged as we got started. Thank you for your care for Dr. Martinez. We are going to go ahead and open the week, and then she's going to post a video as well. But we wanted to get material out to you so that you could get started for this week as well. In the resources section, you'll notice a couple of things. One is some stuff on the Book of Ruth, and you'll need access to that material when we're in class on Thursday. So you can have it on your screen or you can print it out if you've got two screens, but we want to make sure that you've got access to that material. Also, we included just a few more things on the definition of leadership so you can look through some different definitions of leadership. We wanted to highlight for you some major secular definitions of leadership and how those can complement, but also how they're different from some of what we're saying in this class. So we invite you to see that and ask any questions about it, and we look forward to those conversations together. Now I want to share with you some work on context and understanding terrain of leadership is what we call it, particularly helpful with Bolsinger's work in terms of how are we locating ourselves, what resources do we need, do we know where we're going, do we know what tools we have to get where we're going. So that helps just kind of set some of this metaphor for us. But the first place we want to start is what we think is a core concept for leaders as we set context for ourselves and others. And that is what we would call our hopefulness index. Or do we think the world's getting better? Do we think the world's getting worse? What do we think about the world in general? Some of this goes all the way back to a psychologist named Erik Erikson, who said the first issue that we face as human beings is whether or not the world is trustworthy or whether it can be trusted. And that's some of the question that we're getting at. Most people have significant questions about how the world is doing, and so that's one of the reasons we like to address this. You'll notice this slide is a slide of income per person, so it's a broad scale, and it starts in 1800. It goes all the way up to 2019, the latest time that we have data. This is from a group that wrote a book called Factfulness and helps us look at several things that are going on in the world. And you'll notice that across the board on this, income per person has gone up in the past 200 years. And we think that's significant. And they've chosen kind of 4 areas of the world as representative, but it is representative of the world overall. This one has to do with child mortality. And so it's how many 0 to 5-year-olds die in a country. And you'll notice that it was quite high in 1800 for Nigeria, China, Russia, and the United States. And for all but Nigeria, by the time we get to 2018, it is functionally 0. And Nigeria, though it continues to be higher than anyone would like, is significantly lower. One of the things that we want to remind all of us is that the world, no matter what personal experiences we're having in our lives, by what many people would consider kind of significant measures of human life, the world's a better place than it was in 1800, or you'll notice in this slide, even in the 1920s, even in the 1960s. Here's a quote for us to consider, and we can come back to this in class. If you had to choose a moment in history to be born, and you did not know ahead of time who you would be, you didn't know whether you were going to be born into a wealthy family or a poor family, what country you'd be born in, whether you were going to be a man or a woman, if you had to choose blindly what moment you'd want to be born in. And the question is, of course, when would you do? And this person said you choose now. The person who said that is Barack Obama. He said that in 2016. We use it as a reminder to ourselves that, again, there are significant ways that the world, even with the challenges we face, it continues to be a good place to be. That there are significant challenges in the world. There's also significant hopefulness in the world. There always has been. We characterize ourselves not so much as optimists or pessimists, but we characterize ourselves as people who are realistic about what reality is. And you'll find this is a quote that guides us. We live in a time of intense conflict and massive institutional failures, a time of painful endings and of hopeful beginnings. It is a time that feels as if something profound is shifting and dying, while something else, as the playwright and Czech President Václav Havel puts it, wants to be born. I think there are good reasons to suggest that the modern age has ended. Today, many things indicate that we are going through a transitional period, and that while it seems that something is on the way out, something else is being painfully born. It is as if something were crumbling, decaying, exhausting itself, while something else, while indistinct, were rising from the rubble. The crisis of our time is not just the crisis of any single leader, organization, country, or conflict. It is the crisis of our time that reveals the old way is dying, and an old social structure and way of thinking, an old way of institutionalizing and enacting social forms. So partially what we want to note with that, and here's the quote, is that we don't find ourselves pessimists or optimists. We try to find ourselves biblical realists and recognize that this time in which we live, intense conflict, there are failures. There's also hopeful beginnings going on. And if you skip down to the end of that quote, crumbling, decaying, exhausting, while something else, indistinct, were rising from the rubble. We think that's the task of leadership, to be discerning and moving through that. And that's why it's so important for us to be knowing the terrain that we're going on. He goes on and he says, frontline practitioners, managers, teachers, nurses, physicians, laborers, mayors, entrepreneurs, farmers, and business and government leaders share a sense of the current reality. They can feel the heat of an ever-increasing workload and the pressure to do more. Many describe this as running on a treadmill or spinning on a hamster wheel. And that certainly is what it feels like to many of us as we try to lead today, that there are these kinds of intense pressures. That leads us to take very seriously Jesus' words. Particularly, we like the parable of the weeds among the wheat. And on the handout that is, in case is there with this is that parable that reminds us that in Jesus' kingdom there are weeds and there are wheat always together, and so there's always something good and there's always something bad. That leads us to believe that there's a couple of metaphors for us to be able to work in. One is how storied we are as creatures, and we work here with some thoughts from Alistair McIntyre, who says that we cannot characterize behavior independently of intentions, and that narrative history of a certain kind turns out to be the basic and essential genre for the characterization of human actions. He says that the basic distinction for human beings is that human beings can be held to account for that of which they are authors, and that account must always be one of intelligible actions and not just actions. He says we're people who tell stories, and it's important for us to be people who can understand and tell narratives. We'll come back to this. This is a chart from Crucial Conversations, and if you note in it, it says that before we act or feel, we tell a story. And there's always stories operative in the interpretive work that we're doing, and we believe that's really important for us to note. The other metaphor for us is the metaphor of maps, noting that maps help us know where to go, and maps help us locate ourselves. And one of the important things is that in this time when the maps that we've had are no longer working, it becomes more important for leaders to be able to know the terrain. So just a little bit of kind of terrain markers for us as we get going, and then we'll talk about this in class to make sure we're all working together. I mean, with the economic terrain, we believe that it's important for leaders to be able to identify economic terrain, not only economic terrain. We don't think that this is the only driver of human behavior or the only thing that people understand, but we'd want you to see this. Look at the growth in U.S. after-tax income from 1979 to 2011, which is a while ago now, but you can see there's dips here for receptions, but look at the difference between the top 1%, the 81st through 99%, and then other quartiles. You can see it's all up, but it is up more significantly for a very small percentage of our society. Here's U.S. real weekly wages, which you'll notice for the top 10% are up actually significantly. For the median, it's just about flat. And for the bottom 10%, it's essentially flat. It's down about $4 a week. So you see difference, you see growth in some, you see flatness for others. Here's another economic terrain chart for us to be aware of. And what we want to see here is that there are significant ways that poverty actually is down, that the upper middle class is what has grown the most, and that those who are very, very wealthy have also grown significantly. This chart is done by the Urban Institute, which is a relatively nonpartisan group, and helps us understand why in congregations we can see both people who have more and also those who don't have less, which is significant in terms of leading in these days. Spiritual terrain, we look to Charles Taylor, who says that for the first time in human history, a purely self-sufficient humanism has come to be a widely available option. And he means by this a humanism that looks to no final goal besides human flourishing, nor to an allegiance to anything else beyond that flourishing. What he says, and this is what's critical, is of no previous society can that be said to be true. So in his estimation, we face something entirely new here, and he traces that through some levels of secularization, which he calls 1, 2, and 3, which eventually brings us to a place where we are, as leaders, working in and amongst people who have as a widely available option a purely secular understanding of the world. Very important for the type of leadership that we're doing and that we want to talk about with you as a class. One of the things that we note about this is this kind of secularization causes confusion among more what we might call traditional people, but people who have who are used to a world where it is spiritualized, or a world where spiritual understanding is okay to have. And then primarily among young adults, those who are the questions, they're asking questions that most Christian leaders are not prepared to answer. Does the Christian faith and practice make any sense? Why would we do any of this? What is God's agency in this highly secularized world that we experience? We'd also point you to the work of Christian Smith and Melissa Lundquist Denton, who did a national study of American teenagers and came up with a concept that they call moral therapeutic deism, which is, they say, broadly, as they interviewed teenagers inside and outside the church, most of them kind of had these central tenets. They actually believe God exists, who created and ordered the world, watches over human life, that God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy, to feel good about oneself, that God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except where God is needed to resolve a problem, and that good people go to heaven when they die. So you'll notice that actually is a little different than what Taylor is saying, who says that there's this widely available humanism that has nothing beyond the human frame, but it also is it's also a factor in our world that this is what, broadly speaking, teenagers in 2005 inside and outside the church were saying. This leads us to note that younger Americans are more likely to be unaffiliated. So here's the percentage of each generation who identify their religion as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Born between 19 and 28 and 45, 11%, which means 89% of those people would identify with some sort of religious belief, all the way to our younger millennials, those born between 1990 and 1996. So people who are younger adults now, a third of them which makes a huge impact in our social landscape. Spiritual terrain is more complex than any in human history. It involves our own stories about what we believe, what's shaped us, what's nurtured us, what's wounded us. It, in our congregations, means that our adults are navigating a landscape for which they don't have a map because their map doesn't work and they've got anxiety about that. And it is confusion among those we encounter inside and outside the church, among other things which we're interested in talking about with you as a class. There are changing gender roles going on in our society, and one of the things that we want to note about that is that while it is the case that there are increased kind of gender parity, it is not fully the case at all. And for those of us who are in quote unquote the church business, while there is a wider availability for women to be in leadership and others who wouldn't identify as kind of your traditional male, it is not the case that is universally accepted, and that's something for us to talk about as leaders. So changing gender roles becomes a place for us to be aware of the terrain, both on a broad scale but also on a particular scale in local congregations. Human sexuality has had huge shifts and is a terrain where things are no longer the way they were, and if you look at your handout, you'll notice that a sociologist named Anthony Giddens says for us, among all the changes in the world, none is more important than that is happening in our personal lives: sexuality, relationships, marriage, and the family. He goes on to say the traditional family was an economic unit, but now identifies it primarily, and this would be in the Western world, and particularly, I would say, in more urban and wealthier places. It's no longer economic. It's been transferred to a relational category. And he says now marriage in the past has never been based upon intimacy. It was important to a good marriage, but it was not the foundation of it. So that'll be something important for us to talk about and consider as we navigate leadership in this age. If you don't know the concept of postmodernism, we'd recommend that you learn about that. Francis Bacon said that the modern mind exercised power over nature by discovering nature's secret. Habermas calls this the Enlightenment Project. The goal was the intellectual human quest to unlock the secrets of the universe, master nature for human benefit, and create a better world. It gave us rational management of human life, and where knowledge is certain and it's rational. And what he says is that world is by and large gone away, that there's been losses from it, that the risks that have become associated with it, that the climate crisis and relational crises have caused us to doubt whether this is really going to work for us to create a better world. And there are certainly huge gains, but there are also huge losses. End result is postmodern, where any interpretation of reality, which is what I'm giving you now, is an assertion of power, that knowledge is not objective, and that there can be no quest for a supercultural, timeless, universal truth. That, again, is new, something that impacts the terrain as we navigate our quest for leadership. We also want you to be aware of what we call post-Christendom, and that is acknowledging that the church is no longer at the center of the world like it was, that there are not nearly the number of laws that protect the work of the church. There are still some, particularly when it actually comes to some tax laws, and we can talk about this in the class, but blue laws, like things that kept stores closed on Sunday, don't exist anymore. That is related, but not the same as post-Constantinianism. Constantine was the emperor who made a formal alliance with the Christian religion in the 300s. And the legal ties between the church and the state, particularly in the West, have been strong, but they are not nearly there, although vestiges remain. And that's one of the curious things about navigating this terrain is you may go some places and they still want to have a prayer before the state assembly, which happens in Pennsylvania, yet at the same time, people do not want to be told by the church what to do. We also want you to be aware of and prepared to talk about globalization, which has to do with mainly economic realities, that world trade and the ability to move capital among world markets affects the world in ways that were not like it was even actually 20 or 30 years ago. Among this terrain that we're navigating is the terrain of racism. Obviously, I've seen a greater awareness of that in our own country over the summer, along with tragic and horrifying events that have caused that to be the case. I won't read to you, but I'll point you on the handout the words of James Cone and his call for what he says is the proper starting point for the crucial debate about the prospects of Black America is an examination of the nihilism that increasingly pervades Black communities. And there's a call for leadership and for kind of this critical, realistic hope that we believe good leadership can bring. Along that, there's the growing demographic changes and the racial diversity that's coming to our country, and in many ways is already here. Particularly of note to us, in 1960, the population of the United States that was white was 85%. By 2060, which is not that long from now, we will be only 43% white. And what Pew Research says is we were once a black and white country, now we're a rainbow. In the midst of that will be local narratives, stories of congregations, particularities of communities, and stories of individuals that shape and help us understand all of those other parts of landscapes and other parts that we haven't mentioned here, because the landscape and terrain of leadership is complex. We believe that learning to navigate it is very important for leadership. It creates a world that's sometimes called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So, it's environments that are changing quickly, a terrain that's uncertain, very, very complex, and many things that we feel like we don't know or we're just encountering for the first time. The typical North American response to our situation is to analyze a problem and find a solution. These solutions tend to be methodological, arrange all the components of the church landscape differently, and many assume that the problem can be solved or use the best demographic or psychological, sociological insights, and one can redesign the church for success in a changing context. That's from the writers of Missional Church. They go on to say that's inadequate, that we need to go deeper to that. Dr. Bruni and I take that same perspective. They call for a deeply theological response to that, for the church to go back to our core narratives to understand ourselves. We call for that too, and believe that that takes a particular type of leadership that we want to help all of us learn to think through. This all means that the landscape of leadership for all of us as we move forward, the terrain that we're looking at, very complex. It can be interesting, it can be overwhelming, it can be scary, it can be all those things together. We believe it is ever shifting, and that calls for us to learn new skills and learn flexibility, and that it requires people skills. It requires hope, and not a naive hope, but a kind of a critical, realistic hope. It requires interpretive skills. It requires curiosity, and it requires learning. We look forward to talking through more of this terrain, what you're observing, what our authors are saying about this, what you believe this will mean for you as you go through seminary and as you prepare for what is in your future in class.